Mario, go ahead. Please introduce yourself. Floor is yours, man.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Mario Lopez, and I work in the product group from Azure Networking. I'm specialized on anything that has to do with VNet integration for PaaS services. And on today's topic, it's basically about the new product that we just launched last week, which is called Private Link. It has a lot of offerings and benefits on when it comes to consuming PaaS services on Azure. So this is just a little bit of the context of on this conversation for today. Typical feedback that we receive from customers, because at the end of the day, we're listening and adapting to all of this feedback when it comes to all the challenges that they have when it comes to migrating their applications to the cloud and using PaaS services as part of this journey. Of course, everybody loves to use PaaS services because of the managed offering, and it's a bundle package where you don't have to worry about the infrastructure for those. And having all of those in your applications can help customers to rapidly adopt and develop applications and all of their needs without a complex infrastructure in between, and without having to worry about the management of all of this. But again, the story for today is it has some challenges. The typical questions that we have from customers is, I want to consume them privately from on-premises or from my virtual network without having to use a public IP or public endpoint to access the my PaaS resources. And also, while doing so, I also want to prevent any potential data exfiltration from my network. I don't want to be exposed to somebody else's resource, or the ability for someone inside my network to read data and just publish this into another maybe resource within the same service, or maybe in the open internet. So all of those options are very common and concerns, and especially on customers with strong regulations that demands a deep isolation of their workloads, because it's managing sensitive data, and the information is super critical. And of course, nobody wants to be exposed to a potential threat of data exfiltration. Uh, yeah, and at the end of the day, all of these questions comes with the next angle, which is I want to use all of these PaaS services, but I don't want to bring a lot of complexity to my network. I would like to use this easily, and always the configuration should be super simple. And all of these questions and concerns is something that we always take into account when it comes to developing the product, in this case, privately. So now, a little bit of the agenda. I have some structure here, and feel free to tell me if any of this needs to be more deeper, or we need to maybe skip some of those topics in case it might be already well known. But I have just the basics, the overview, a little bit of the network security options, and common questions about what Private Link does in with respect to network configurations. Um, the overview, we use this content to represent what the product is, and basically Private Link is a new product that gives you the ability to connect to Azure services privately and secure. um, One of the main concepts that you'll see in Private Link, again, Private Link as a product has one resource that you can use to connect to any service, no matter what the service is, which is private endpoint. And it's nothing but exactly what the name is telling. It's a private IP address or a private endpoint from your network that you can now reach to, and it'll give you the access to one of the resources that you're connecting over this private endpoint. So you might be connecting to a storage account, a SQL server, maybe your own private link service. Any of the options or any of the PaaS services will basically come and adapt into this model where you'll have a consistent experience. My method to connect to this resource on this service is by using a private endpoint. Now, the benefits that gives you the private endpoint once you have this in your network is it is completely routable and connected to your applications. Any traffic coming from on-premises over a private peering or VPN connections can reach to this private endpoint. Also, of course, any application deployed within the same VNet or peer networks, including globally peer networks, can reach into this private endpoint and access the resource, no matter the location where these VNets are coming from. Um, On top of that, we went one step ahead and give an additional protection. Not just connecting is not the only thing that customers are asking us when it comes to PaaS services. They also want to have the confidence that when I'm connecting to my storage account, I'm not exposed to any other storage account behind the same service. And that's where the data exfiltration, the built-in data exfiltration protection comes in, where by creating this private endpoint on the platform, we're taking the responsibility to add an additional network layer of protection that every single traffic that you send to this private endpoint will only be able to reach a specific storage account and a specific resource. And in this context, if you have one private endpoint and the relationship is one storage account, then any other storage account, any other SQL server, any other resource behind the same service is not reachable through the same private endpoint. It is a one-to-one mapping to a specific resources, and this gives you an extra confidence that we're validating on the platform that the traffic is only reaching your resources and nothing else. The benefit for that is, of course, your workload. Let's say that you have an application that is consuming, let's say, a SQL server. You can completely remove any access to the internet, any access to public IPs, or even the service tags or the public IPs from the service are no longer required. Your traffic is private from your VM to the private endpoint, and you can fully restrict the traffic outbound to the internet without any concerns about any exfiltration from your workloads. At that point, anyone that could be inside your network will not have the power to release any data outside. Um, so it is an important aspect of what Private Link is giving on the context of PaaS services. Of course, on top of this, there comes a lot of simplifications. We're giving a predictable IP address to your resources. Basically, whenever you deploy your resources, you'll have a predictable IP from your subnets, and you can now configure NSGs or firewalls or virtual appliance, anything that you have, without having to track the dynamic nature of the public IPs that those services currently have. You have a more predictable scenarios for all your configurations. And we're adding a lot of simplifications in many different angles, of course, always taking into consideration customer feedback. One of those is, for example, access across different AD tenants or across different organizations where maybe they have a separation of duties and the storage admin is one role within their organization and maybe the network admin is another one. So we have an ability to create a private endpoint to somebody else's resource without having permission, but it will go into pending state. And this will kick an approval process that the storage admin can then come and approve this connection. And then you'll basically have a two-way handshake operation where someone is requesting access, but the resource owner is the one approving the access. And by having this operation, you don't have to worry about if it's on a different subscription, if it's on a different AD tenant, if it's from somebody else. It's a two-step process where based on the permissions from each role, you'll get a private endpoint in an approved state that it's equally as good as any other private endpoint in your network. You can now reach to those resources without having to worry about any of these RBAC permissions after that. Um, we're also doing integration on the DNS story. This is an important aspect when it comes to PaaS services because everyone using this PaaS services today on Azure, they are familiar with the process. They just create a storage account and they get an FQDN where they can connect to it. Now the challenge here is that when we have a private endpoint in our network, then the public DNS records are no longer applicable for connecting to that storage account. And also, we browse among preview customers whether or not it was acceptable to have a record in the public DNS containing the private IP address from their network, and we had a clear answer that it was not the right method for solving the DNS challenge. Now, so what we went ahead is that we had an integration that each service is doing as part of the public preview criteria, where whenever you're connecting to a storage account, you'll have an integration where you'll be able to override the FQDN for that storage account in your DNS configuration. And even we went straight and actually simplified this on even portal. You have a simple toggle yes and no that gives you the DNS configuration required to connect to a storage account. Now, some of the important aspects for this is that because, again, customers using the PaaS service are not familiar to creating the DNS record, now they will have to, because we need to resolve the DNS configuration into a private IP. But at least we're making it easier to go into this step and not really adding a lot of complexity into this process, because we know that it might not be a typical DNS admin, the person who is creating this private endpoint. Um, so this is in general the overview of the private endpoint. Now I'll jump ahead just a little bit of the roadmap, because the natural questions that comes is, okay, we started with storage, ADLS Gen 2, SQL DB, and data warehouse are the ones that are currently in public preview, but we're also working towards adding every single service that we can into this list. Of course, always capturing feedback from customers on what services are the more critical ones for them, and the ones that are maybe in their secure environments or the more strict environments, and that's where we're going to keep adding services into this list as a roadmap for us. The idea for us is to get everyone into this method so that at the end of the day the customers gets the benefit of connecting privately to all of those services that are currently hosted in a public endpoint. And this is just a brief overview on the roadmap that we have for this year. Of course, we're going to keep expanding the list, and hopefully next year we'll keep adding more and more services into this method. Now, coming into the security model for the Private Link PaaS resource, I'm using as an example here a SQL server, and as I explained before, we have on the private endpoints we have the ability to connect to a specific resource, but we understand that customers will have a migration process, because we're not expecting anyone to recreate or redeploy their SQL servers or their storage accounts. So therefore, the security model for each resource, it has the possibility to keep connections open from private endpoints or from public endpoints based on the restrictions defined on the IP firewall section, or maybe using service endpoints as well. Those three communication channels are independent. So on a given SQL server, you can access over the internet with a public IP. You can access using service endpoints with a subnet rule there that accepts the traffic from a given subnet, or you can access from a private endpoint. And those are independently. You can have a mix or hybrid resource that has connections from both two or three channels, and it's absolutely acceptable. When you think about your applications, you have to think about, okay, what's the safest method for me to migrate into this private connection? Maybe I have, let's say, 5 VMs that are connecting to the same SQL server. I'll go one by one, and I'll create the private endpoint, and I'll start moving the connections one by one to use the private endpoint now. And I will keep the current configuration that I have. Maybe I have service endpoints for that, or maybe I have IP firewall for that. I'll keep that configuration for now. But migrating the 5 VMs in a one by one process will give you the guarantees that your application will not be down for at the same time, because you'll be basically have a higher availability by taking care of this migration process. Of course, after moving all of the applications back to a private connection, you can now go back to the resource and then maybe remove the rules that were accepting traffic over the internet, or maybe from service endpoints, and then keep that resource exclusively with private endpoints. But we want this to be a process that every customer takes into consideration when it comes to using private endpoints. It cannot be a simple swap where we just pretend that everything will just move here, because at the VM level, the connection is already established to the public endpoint, and we need to be very careful in this context. So yeah, that's why we have these three connectivity methods to these resources. Of course, this is for the ones that we're releasing at the moment. They have the settings already. We might have in the future resources that are maybe coming new services that maybe they will not have the other two methods, because they might come from fresh in a private setup, and you will not have to worry about the other settings. And yeah, like I explained before, it is unlike just one of the main questions or frequent questions that we have from customers. Okay, when should I choose service endpoints versus private endpoints? And the answer is if you have if you have any concern about data exfiltration, that's where this is the variation or the value added of private link. We're going to a specific resource, and therefore from a private endpoint you cannot access any other resource. Unlike in service endpoints, you can still access other resources using the same routing configuration. It's a little bit of the concepts. We have like I explained before, the private endpoint is the main building block for this. Every time you think about connecting to any resource in Azure, you'll use a private endpoint for that. And this is basically the anatomy and the structure for the private endpoint. It has three main components, but in reality, it's just two aspects that should be a must for having your private endpoint correctly set up. The first one is you have to specify what's the resource that you're connecting to. This can be any of the options, like an storage account, SQL Server, like I explained. All these resources will keep adding, and you'll have more options on what are the things that you can connect to from a private endpoint perspective. We also have the ability for customers to build their own private link service, and that's also one of the options that you can specify in this property. The second option that it's absolutely required is a subnet, where it's basically where we allocate the IP for. It's basically where do you want this private endpoint to be deployed to. Then we have a lot of optional parameters. The third one that I would probably suggest that it's super critical, even though it's not an absolutely must, is to use a DNS configuration solution for that. You can either use your custom DNS if you have your own DNS, or you can use private zone, and that will give you the power to just go and override this record so that you can now start resolving to the private IP. This is a critical aspect because majority of the services and in majority of the scenarios, the traffic is using the FQDN, the connection. Your string has a fully qualified domain name, and you need to follow the same domain name because there's at the application layer, there's an encryption layer that is taking into consideration a certificate associated with that domain. If you attempt to use your own domain, you might not get the correct encryption handshake, and therefore you won't be able to connect. The same happens if you're using just the IP directly. You won't be able to connect because at the application layer, there's an additional layer of encryption based on this domain. So it is a key aspect to have a good DNS integration and to resolve privately the FQDN so that you can connect privately. Now, when it comes to choosing the subnet, we have the first aspect is, and one of the questions that we have from customers, okay, how many IPs do I need for a given resource? This is just a simplified version, but in short, the short answer is we'll always consume one IP address as a default. But we have some scenarios where you might need more IPs than just one, and those scenarios are typically associated with the number of regional endpoints that you're accessing. So for example, if you have an storage account that is replicated in East US and West US, you'll need one IP, one for each region, because we basically need to have two FQDNs and the access needs to be routed differently. A similar scenario happens with Cosmos DB, which is a globally distributed resource that could be replicated across many regions. Whenever you have many regions, then you'll need one for each region. Again, it's the same reason because the traffic goes differently, and also your DNS integration needs to have a different resolution for each region. It's a different FQDN for each region. So yeah, whenever you see this logic, you'll see that okay, in majority of the cases you have one IP, but in the cases where the resource is replicated, you might need more than one IP. When it comes to choosing the subnet, we hear a lot of feedback from customers about one of the models where we have PaaS services deployed inside customers' network today, and the fact that it's not ideal for their scenario to have a dedicated subnet for deploying PaaS services. So therefore, we have basically the ability to deploy private endpoints on any subnet. And you can mix and match private endpoints from different PaaS resources. You can deploy private endpoints along your VMs and maybe your workloads. The only caveat here is just during the preview is that we don't have support for NSGs. So the effect for the NSGs, meaning you won't be able to restrict the traffic that is coming to the private endpoint using your energy rules. That's something that is coming later on, but just taking this consideration aside is basically you'll have the full flexibility to deploy the private endpoints along your workloads in any way you prefer. And this gives you the full flexibility to choose the right model. Maybe you want to choose the private endpoints along the VMs, or maybe you want to keep a separate subnet just for the private endpoints, and maybe there you want to mix storage SQL and the rest of the services as well. It's basically a flexibility option that we're giving to customers to let them choose what's the right method depending on your topologies. Now, again, this like I explained before, we have in the roadmap the support for NSGs and ASGs as well in private endpoints, which will give you the security model for your access controls to your PaaS resources. If you're able to mix them into the same subnet, then you'll be able to control the traffic and specify the rules, maybe based on another group of applications that is described by ASG, or maybe CIDR ranges with maybe the IP range that you know that is coming from your on-premises. You'll basically be able to restrict the traffic. In the current shape, this is not applicable, is not enforced by the NSG. This is coming more towards the GA timeframe. Okay, and let me see actually a little bit of time. Yeah, the next aspect is just the DNS configuration. I'll try to jump a little bit quicker because I noticed that we're taking more time than used. This I already explained with a lot of emphasis on this one, but you have many options. You have the ability to choose private zone within your VNet, and you'll be able to resolve privately. If you're coming from on-premises or you have your own custom DNS, you can also use that and still resolve into a private IP by creating the records and the DNS server that you own. Or even if you want, you can even have a hybrid configuration where you have a DNS conditional forwarder for anything that has to do with the service. You can just forward that into the private zone, and then you'll be able to resolve privately without having to have a hard time with the DNS configuration. This is actually the easiest method, which is just forward the resolution to the private zone, and then every new private endpoint that comes in, it'll just keep adding records into this private zone, and then you will no longer have to worry about managing this manually into your custom DNS. We have more recommendations on the public documentation, again, in how to configure the DNS for your private endpoints. Like I'll skip this one and without too much detail, but we have the ability to create private endpoints with an approval workflow where it'll basically start a process that the PaaS resource owner can now go and approve the connection. And this doesn't need any special AD exchange of permissions. All you need to do is create a private endpoint in pending, and then the PaaS resource owner can now approve that connection, and it'll be as good as any other private endpoint in your network. This is a good summary picture of how you can now start using private endpoints in your network. We hear that a lot of customers like the hub and spoke topology, and one of the best practices could be that you have all your private endpoints maybe in one subnet where you start just to deploy everything that is accessible from any connectable network that you have. Maybe you have on-premises that you want to reach to the private endpoint, so you use a VPN or express route private peering. Of course, we support within the VNet and peer networks, no matter where the traffic is or the peering is located on. We also support that the PaaS resource can be on a different region. So, for example, you might have your VNet in East US, but the SQL server might be in West US, or maybe in another side of the in another region within Azure, and it's absolutely fine for you to create a private endpoint to a remote resource. It doesn't even affect your performance or your latency. If you have a topology like the one that I have right here, you can connect from a VM in West US, peer to another VNet in East US, but maybe the resource is still in West US. And some customers might think that, oh, maybe this will introduce some latency and performance degradation into my connections. But the reality is that we're optimizing this already in the platform. If you have a peering like this setup, we're making sure that from your VM, you're going straight to the service in the most optimal routing configuration. You don't have to worry about what's the location of the resource or what's the location of my VMs and my VNets. We'll basically take the fastest path possible within the backbone of Azure, and you don't have to worry about basically the location. It's something that you can just not use as a preference for to choose where do you want to put the private endpoints. You can just be more free and choose the right location that suits your needs and your logical organizations. Okay, I think I'm gonna just go to a demo quickly because for the sake of time, I think that we're almost getting over. So this is the portal experience, and this is the private link center where you have the options for managing all of your private endpoints. This is where you can start using this functionality. The first option that I would like to expose here is the ability to create private resources. So in this case, let's say that you have a storage account, you can just simply go here, and as we keep adding services, you'll start to see more options here, with which is basically the ones that you can choose to connect to or to start deploying into your networks. Now, in this option, you can now start creating let me do a random name here. You can now start deploying a storage account, and it'll give you the option in the networking section where you have the three options here available. This is basically the defaults that we have today. You can consume this storage account over a public endpoint. You can add restrictions over the same public endpoint, but you have an option here to create a private endpoint in the same process, and this will give you the ability basically to say, okay, I want to create a private endpoint to my storage account, and in this context, it'll basically create on the fly. Let's say that I'll just select one of these VNets and subnets, not this one, sorry. Um, Maybe this subnet. It'll automatically give you all the parameters that you need for a private endpoint, so that you can, after this, start connecting to that storage account. The DNS configuration, again, as it explained before, it is a simple toggle yes or no. If you click yes, we'll do everything that we need to do to make sure that you have the DNS configuration in this VNet, so that you can now start connecting to that storage account. And by doing this, at the end of this process is basically you'll have a storage account that is privately accessible only. It has no connections whatsoever or any rule that it's accepting any traffic from the public internet. It's completely private, and it will basically be deployed into one of your subnets, and you'll be able to reach to that storage account without having to use any public endpoint at all. The same experience will be bringing in a consistent fashion to any service that it comes in this method, where you'll have the ability to create from fresh the resource privately. The same thing happens with let me go back to for existing resources. So you have the option as well in the left, which is creating a connection to an existing resource. And it has a very similar set of UI and workflow, where you can specify the private endpoint, but in this context, maybe the storage account it's already existing. So my private endpoint, just give it a random name. In the next tab, you'll see that here I have the ability to connect to my resources in my own Active Directory, or I can connect to somebody else's resource. This is the approval workflow that I was describing before. And then whenever you browse this option, you can choose even from different subscriptions, maybe a SQL Server from that subscription, or maybe a storage account. Let me see, where do I have the storage account, maybe from that subscription. So I have a few examples. And then by selecting that, it's basically giving you all the options. And then on the next tab is just selecting the VNet, the subnet, and the DNS configuration. Same UI, same workflow, but this is basically giving you an idea on how you can start using but to connect to your own resources, or you can create the resource from fresh. So we have the two options, and this is the best way to start using the product, the private link. So I think I'll go back just to the Q&A. I think I'm already over the time, so I don't know if there's any questions that we need to cover.
Mario, thanks. That's very useful. Folks, once again, I know we are a bit over time. If you have any questions, please open up your mic and ask the question. And I really want to apologize for the IMs not working. I have opened a support ticket. I'm working on it. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And Mario, one question, can you share the slide deck?
For sure. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you, because we have a YouTube site where we post the session recording and the slide deck. So folks, if there are no other questions, thank you for joining. And Mario, thanks for presenting. That was really helpful. And to be honest, I have, we're playing around with stuff for some time, but I really learned some new stuff with this session. So thank you. Thank you for delivering that. And let's hope to see everybody next week for the session of Azure Power Lunch. Have a good day, everyone.